Plains stretched out like an endless sea of barren earth, where nothing but the wind dared to whisper. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the vastness of the plains seemed to swallow the light, leaving behind an eerie twilight. In this desolate expanse, a lone figure stood by the side of a deserted road, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was something wrong, something that didn't belong in the emptiness. Shadows, long and distorted, began to crawl across the ground, moving with a life of their own. They danced to the edge of sight, disappearing the moment he tried to focus on them. A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, as if they were converging, drawn to him like moths to a flame. The figure took a step back, his breath quickening. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound, a low, mournful wail that echoed across the plains. It was a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. As the last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the plains into darkness, the figure turned to run. But it was too late. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him in their cold embrace. And in that moment, the Nullarbor Plains claimed another soul, swallowed by the darkness that lay hidden in its depths. The Nullarbor Plains, a place so vast and empty that it seemed to stretch on forever, was not a place most people dared to visit. The flat, treeless landscape was as unforgiving as it was endless. A place where the horizon seemed to blur with the sky, and the silence was so thick it pressed down on your chest. But for those who sought adventure or simply wanted to escape the hustle of the city, the Nullarbor offered a kind of strange allure. For three friends, Emma, Jake, and Liam, the plains represented the ultimate road trip. They had heard the stories, of course, the ones locals whispered late at night about strange disappearances and ghostly figures seen wandering the endless flatlands. But they were young and eager for excitement, and the idea of uncovering a mystery thrilled them more than it scared them. They packed their van with supplies, armed with nothing but a few maps and their curiosity, and set off across the vast expanse. The sun was high when they entered the Nullarbor, and the sky was a brilliant blue. But even in the bright light of day, there was something unsettling about the landscape. It was too quiet, still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As they drove deeper into the plains, the road stretched on endlessly, a single strip of asphalt cutting through the barren land. The further they went, the more isolated they felt, the rest of the world falling away behind them. The only signs of life were the occasional kangaroo hopping in the distance, and the crows that circled overhead, their cries piercing the stillness. Emma, the most adventurous of the group, was the first to break the silence. "I bet there's some cool stuff out there," she said, pointing to the horizon. "Maybe even some old Aboriginal carvings or caves." Jake, who was driving, nodded. "Yeah, maybe. Or maybe we'll find something else, something the stories didn't tell us about." Liam, sitting in the back, felt a shiver run down his spine at Jake's words. He forced a laugh. "Come on, you two. You're not really scared, are you?" But even as they laughed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The plains were empty, yes, but they were not alone. There was something out there, something watching them, hidden in the shadows that the bright sun couldn't quite banish. As the day wore on, the excitement of the road trip began to wear thin. The endless road and the monotonous landscape had a way of draining energy, and soon, the three friends found themselves driving in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The van's radio had long since lost its signal, leaving only the low hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires to fill the void. By late afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains. The light was beginning to take on a strange, reddish hue, and the air grew heavier, as if the land itself was shifting under the weight of something unseen. Emma leaned forward, squinting at the horizon. "Do you guys see that?" she asked, pointing ahead. Jake and Liam both looked up, their eyes following her finger. In the distance, just beyond where the road seemed to disappear, a cluster of shapes loomed. At first, they thought it might be a small settlement, maybe a few old shacks or an outpost. But as they drew closer, the shapes resolved into something else entirely. It was a series of large, black stones, jutting out of the ground in unnatural formations. They stood in stark contrast to the flat, barren land around them, as if they had been placed there deliberately. But by whom? And why? Jake slowed the van to a crawl as they approached the stones. A cold wind began to blow, rustling through the sparse, dry grass that clung to the ground. The air felt charged, almost electric, and the shadows cast by the stones seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. "I don't like this," Liam muttered from the back seat, his earlier bravado gone. "This place gives me the creeps." But Emma, ever the explorer, was already reaching for the door handle. "We've got to check it out," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. This could be some ancient site or something. Reluctantly, Jake and Liam followed her as she stepped out of the van. The ground beneath their feet was hard and cracked, and every step seemed to echo in the stillness. As they approached the stones, the temperature seemed to drop, and the wind carried with it a faint, almost inaudible whispering. Emma reached out to touch one of the stones, her fingers brushing against its cool, rough surface. Instantly, the whispering grew louder, as if the stones themselves were speaking, their voices merging into a low, haunting murmur that seemed to come from all around them. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the shadows cast by the stones lengthened, stretching toward the three friends like dark tendrils. Panic surged through them as the realization hit something ancient and powerful was waking, something that should have been left undisturbed. Jake grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her back toward the van. "We need to get out of here," he shouted over the growing wind. But as they turned to flee, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around their ankles and pulling them down. The air was filled with the sound of their screams, swallowed by the darkness that now engulfed them. The shadows that had engulfed them felt like icy fingers, tightening their grip with every passing second. Emma, Jake, and Liam struggled against the darkness, but it was as if the very air had turned solid, pressing down on them from all sides. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted, and they found themselves lying on the cold, hard ground, gasping for breath. The three friends slowly got to their feet, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The stones loomed above them, silent and menacing, but something had changed. The landscape around them, once familiar and bathed in the fading light of day, was now shrouded in an unnatural twilight. The sun had disappeared, leaving only a pale, sickly glow on the horizon. "What just happened?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Jake shook his head, unable to find the words. Emma, always the brave one, was uncharacteristically silent, her eyes locked on the stones as if searching for answers in their ancient surfaces. Without warning, a low, rumbling sound echoed across the plains, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. The stones began to glow faintly, emitting a dull, red light that pulsed in time with the rumbling. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the whispering they had heard before returned, louder and more insistent. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice breaking the spell that had fallen over them now. But as they turned to head back to the van, they realized with mounting horror that it was no longer there. The road, the vehicle, everything familiar had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of barren land that seemed to extend in all directions. They were completely and utterly lost. Panic set in as they tried to make sense of their surroundings. The shadows that had once been confined to the ground now moved freely, swirling around them in a sinister dance. Every time one of them reached out, it dissolved into the air, only to reappear somewhere else, closer and more threatening. Emma, struggling to keep her composure, pointed to a faint light flickering in the distance. "Look, over there. Maybe someone can help us." Clinging to this small hope, the three of them stumbled toward the light, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the eerie silence. The light seemed to grow brighter as they approached, but the shadows grew darker, more oppressive, as if trying to pull them back. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the source of the light, a small, dilapidated hut, its windows glowing with an otherworldly, pale blue light. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. Jake hesitated, then pushed the door open. The inside of the hut was sparsely furnished, with only a rickety table and a few old chairs. A single lantern sat in the center of the table, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The shadows outside pressed against the windows, their dark forms twisting and writhing as if trying to force their way in. "Something's not right here," Emma whispered, her eyes darting around the room. Suddenly, the whispering from outside ceased, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the hut. The voice spoke in a language they couldn't understand, but its tone was unmistakably hostile. The walls began to close in, the room growing smaller with every passing moment. The shadows outside clawed at the windows, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The friends huddled together, their breath visible in the frigid air. As the voice grew louder and more menacing, Jake spotted something on the floor, partially hidden under a tattered rug. It was a trapdoor, its edges worn and splintered. "Look," he shouted, pointing to it. "Maybe we can get out through there." With trembling hands, they pulled the rug aside and pried the trapdoor open. Below them was a narrow, dark tunnel that seemed to lead deeper into the earth. They had no choice. It was either face whatever was coming for them in the hut or take their chances in the tunnel. One by one, they descended into the darkness, the air growing colder and the shadows above reaching out in a final, desperate attempt to grab hold of them. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the walls around them seemed to pulse, as if alive. The oppressive feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before, and the whispering began again, louder and more frantic. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the Nullarbor Plains. They could feel the weight of the land pressing down on them, the darkness closing in. But there was no turning back now. They had to find a way out before the shadows claimed them forever. The tunnel seemed endless, a winding maze of darkness that twisted and turned beneath the barren surface of the Nullarbor Plains. Emma, Jake, and Liam moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the damp, stone walls. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something rotten and ancient, as if they were walking through the grave of a forgotten world. As they ventured deeper, the whispers that had haunted them grew louder, more distinct, though still unintelligible. The walls around them pulsed with a sickly, greenish light, casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker and move on their own. Fear gnawed at their hearts, but they pressed on, driven by the desperate hope of finding an escape. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling was lost in darkness, and the walls were lined with strange, rune-like carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber stood an enormous stone altar, its surface etched with the same runes. But these were different, older, more powerful. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, and the ground beneath their feet trembled with every step. Emma was the first to approach the altar, drawn to it by some unseen force. The closer she got, the more the whispers began to coalesce into a single, coherent voice, deep, resonant, and filled with malice. It spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but its intent was clear. They were trespassers, and they had awakened something that should have remained undisturbed. Jake and Liam, too, felt the pull of the altar, their fear giving way to a strange, almost hypnotic compulsion. They stepped closer, their eyes fixed on the glowing runes, unable to look away. The chamber seemed to close in around them, the walls shifting and warping as if alive. Then, with a deafening roar, the ground beneath the altar split open, and a column of black smoke erupted from the chasm, spiraling upward like a living thing. The smoke twisted and writhed, forming into a shape a towering figure, dark and malevolent, with eyes that burned like embers. It was a creature of shadow, born from the ancient darkness that had lain hidden beneath the plains for centuries. The figure spoke, its voice a chorus of 1,000 tortured souls. "You have entered the domain of the Ancient Ones. Your souls are forfeit." Emma, Jake, and Liam stood frozen in terror, unable to move as the shadowy figure loomed over them. The ground shook violently, and the walls of the chamber began to crack, sending chunks of stone crashing to the floor. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the sound of the earth splitting apart. In a final, desperate act, Jake broke free from the figure's hypnotic gaze and lunged toward Emma, grabbing her arm. "We have to get out of here now." His voice snapped Liam out of his trance, and together, the three of them turned and fled back into the tunnel, the roar of the shadowy creature echoing behind them. The tunnel shook violently, rocks and debris falling from the ceiling as they ran. But they didn't dare look back. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more frantic, but the path ahead was clear. They could see a faint light at the end of the tunnel, a small, glimmering hope in the encroaching darkness. The light grew brighter as they approached, and with one final burst of energy, they burst through the tunnel's entrance and out into the open air. They stumbled to the ground, gasping for breath as the tunnel behind them collapsed, sealing the ancient evil within. The plains were bathed in the pale light of dawn, the nightmare seemingly over. But as they looked back at the ground where the tunnel had been, they saw the shadows still shifting, moving beneath the surface like a living thing. They had escaped, but they knew in their hearts that the darkness they had awakened was not gone. It was waiting, biding its time until the next unfortunate souls ventured too far into the Nullarbor Plains. The shadows would rise again, and when they did, there would be no escape. The dawn's early light painted the Nullarbor Plains in soft hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the terror that had unfolded just hours before. Emma, Jake, and Liam sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the spot where the tunnel had collapsed. The ground was still and quiet now, but they knew better than to trust the calm. Beneath the surface, the shadows waited, restless and hungry. For a long time, none of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. The events of the night had shaken them to their core, stripping away their bravado and leaving them raw with fear. They had come to the Nullarbor in search of adventure, but what they found was something far darker and more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Finally, it was Emma who broke the silence. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "We need to leave this place. We can't stay here." Jake nodded in agreement, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel of the van. "We're lucky to be alive. Whatever that thing was, it's still down there. We woke it up, and it won't stop until it's free." Liam, usually the joker of the group, was uncharacteristically solemn. "But what if it gets out? What if someone else comes here?" And his words trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging heavy in the air. They all knew the answer. The shadows that haunted the Nullarbor Plains were ancient, patient, and insatiable. It was only a matter of time before the darkness found a way to escape, to claim more victims. They packed up their belongings in silence, each movement slow and deliberate, as if they were afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the plains. The van rumbled to life, and they set off down the long, empty road. The landscape round them eerily quiet. As they drove away, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. But the shadows were not like those of the night before. They were normal, ordinary shadows, cast by the rocks and sparse trees that dotted the plains. And yet, as they looked back one last time, they could not shake the feeling that something was watching them, hidden in the depths of the earth, waiting for its chance to rise again. The road stretched out before them, endless and empty, but they knew they would never forget the horrors they had witnessed. The Nullarbor Plains had left its mark on them, a scar that would never fully heal. They had survived, but the shadows would haunt their dreams for years to come, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. And so, with the sun climbing higher in the sky and the vast expanse of the Nullarbor behind them, they drove on, hoping to leave the nightmares behind. But deep down, they knew that some things could never be escaped, that the shadows of the Nullarbor Plains would follow them, no matter how far they ran. As you turn the final page of this tale, the shadows of the Nullarbor Plains may begin to fade, but their chilling presence lingers. The vast, empty plains, the ancient stones, and the malevolent whispers, these are more than just figments of imagination. They remind us that the world is full of strange, unexplained phenomena that lie just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Have you ever encountered something that sent shivers down your spine? A shadow that moved when it shouldn't have? A whisper in the dead of night? Or perhaps an eerie feeling that you weren't alone? We all have stories that linger in the dark corners of our minds. Stories that we hesitate to tell because they seem too unbelievable or too frightening. But here, in the company of others who understand the thrill of a good scare, your story can find a home. Share your own experiences with the unknown, the eerie, and the unexplainable. Whether it's a ghostly encounter, a mysterious sound in the middle of the night, or a place that holds secrets too terrifying to tell, we want to hear it. Join the conversation with fellow readers who, like you, have felt the chill of the unknown. Post your stories, discuss the mysteries of the world, and let the shadows come to life through your words. After all, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we live ourselves.